her expertise, patients come to see Dr. Ferguson from all over the state of Iowa, all 50 states, and even internationally. But if the child with this condition is insured by an out-of-state Medicaid program, evaluation and treatment by Dr. Ferguson could, depending on the state, require multiple levels of administrative approval, could be denied administratively, and could be delayed because of other administrative burdens. These delays of weeks to months could potentially cause irrevocable harm to the child's health and future. Sadly, we know of children with this rare disease who have already suffered the consequences of this administrative red tape when they could have been helped very quickly by Dr. Ferguson. I have given you an example where a child with a rare disease and complex medical needs from outside of Iowa could be helped by the bill under discussion, but of course, the reciprocal is also true. There will be cases where children on Iowa Medicaid with rare diseases and complex medical needs might be greatly helped by receiving their care in an expedited fashion in another state. This bill is good for Iowa's children and good for children across the country. I urge this committee to act now and pass H.R. 4758, Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you, Dr. Basouk. The chair will now recognize Dr. Kesselheim for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee. I'm Aaron Kesselheim, and I lead the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law at Harvard Med. Thank you for inviting me today to this special hearing on Rare Disease Day about various proposals covering the care of patients with rare diseases. I want to highlight a few bills being debated and how they do and don't help such patients. 2, the Orphan Cures Act and Mini Acts amend the Inflation Reduction Act, which created a novel pathway for drug price negotiation by Medicare, bringing it in line with all other goods and services Medicare covers. Negotiation of prescription drug prices is important because rare disease patients, like all patients, pay far more for brand-name drugs in the U.S. than comparable countries. The IRA is designed to help Medicare reach a fair price that reflects the drug's clinical value. It covers drugs with $200 million a year in Medicare sales that have been on the market already 9 to 13 years. The IRA has numerous exclusions, including drugs for a single rare disease. That exemption may have been included to ensure negotiators prioritize drugs that affect broader populations, but in reality, single rare disease drugs generate substantial revenue. Among approved single rare disease drugs in the last decade, we found that the median drug had earned $11 billion in global revenues in its first 9 years on the market, with Medicare spending on these products increasing from $3.4 billion in 2012 to $10 billion in 2021. In other research we've done, 5-year net sales on drugs for rare diseases were no different than drugs for more common diseases. Thus, in these cases, developing drugs for rare diseases has been extremely lucrative for manufacturers, which is one reason why over half of new drugs approved by the FDA each year are rare disease drugs. Yet the Orphan Cures Act would expand the rare Medicare negotiation exemption to drugs approved for multiple rare diseases. The median multiple rare disease drug in the last decade had $746 million in peak annual Medicare expenditures, 35% higher than the median sole rare disease drug. There's no reason to exclude such blockbusters from a negotiation process that could help achieve a fair price and increase rare disease patients' access to the drugs they need. The Orphan Cures Act also would delay negotiation on drugs that get a rare disease designation before being approved for a more common indication. But such drugs are among the most successful in Medicare, drugs like Keytruda, Opdivo, Yervoy, to name a few, and not one of them has a peak annual revenue below $2 billion a year. Instead of providing these drugs with a huge undeserved windfall, we should be encouraging firms to accelerate clinical development for secondary indications. The Mini Act also includes a negotiation delay, in this case 9 to 13 years for so-called advanced drug products, a category it defines vaguely, which could lead to variable interpretation after enactment. Would the exclusion cover a drug like ivacaftor, approved to treat a specific rare genetic mutation in subsets of patients with cystic fibrosis? This and one of its follow-on products for another rare CF mutation was estimated to have a net present value of $33 billion a few years after their approval. No harm to innovation would come from the timely price negotiation of such drugs. Another bill up for discussion would renew the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher, which is one of the most ill-conceived drug policy ideas of the last 2 decades. Companies getting a rare pediatric disease drug approved can earn the voucher that accelerates FDA review of a non-innovative, costly drug by a few months. Innovative drugs already get priority review. But our controlled studies have found that these vouchers do not help start new trials or bring new drugs to market in any field, much less rare pediatric diseases, and the FDA considers them disruptive to its review processes. There are far better ways to promote effective care for rare disease patients, including some of the bills being discussed today. First, the RARE Act closes a court-created loophole in the Orphan Drug Act and would help ensure that drugs for rare diseases face competition in a timely fashion, which can help lower prices and ensure a stable supply of rare disease drugs. Second, the ALS Better Care Act would direct resources to paying for services for ALS patients and encourages engagement with clinical trials for new treatments for this important disease. Third, the Innovation in Pediatric Drugs Act would generate more testing of rare disease drugs in children, which is often waived despite being required before approval and is deferred for years and years after the drug is already approved because there is no incentive or requirements on manufacturers to do these essential studies of these drugs in children. And therefore, children will end up with rare diseases, will end up using drugs for years without sufficient guidance because drug companies delay these trials. Bills like these provide useful, direct support for clinical care and essential research and will be most meaningful for patients with rare diseases. We should proceed with these efforts and avoid drug policy gimmicks like the priority review voucher or bills that undermine efforts to establish fair prices on blockbuster rare disease drugs. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Kesselheim. Professor Chin, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and distinguished members of the committee. The opinions I offer today are my own, and they do not represent the views of the University of Southern California or the USC Schaefer Center. Drug innovation has been crucial in addressing unmet patient needs. For rare diseases, treatment options are often limited, and new drug developments can provide hope to patients and families facing challenging health conditions. Moreover, patients highly value these treatments. Our research at USC Schaefer Center has demonstrated that while patients are generally sensitive to out-of-pocket costs, they are willing to pay higher prices for treatments of rare and complex diseases. So to continue developing the types of innovations that patients value, manufacturers must expect positive returns on their drug development. This undertaking is challenging. On average, over 90% of drugs fail, and of the small subset that do succeed, it takes about 10 to 15 years from progress to initial discovery, to market approval. This high risk of significant financial loss requires difficult trade-offs. Drug manufacturers will typically be forced to pursue drugs with the greatest market potential as measured by the size of the target patient population and potential revenue streams of a specific drug. Due to the limited number of patients affected, rare diseases inherently present weaker financial incentives for drug innovation. That is why our society has created policies like the 1983 Orphan Drug Act to encourage rare disease drug development. Research has shown that 90% of the innovations stimulated by the Orphan Drug Act would not have occurred in absence of the policy. However, orphan drugs also tend to be some of the most expensive drugs on the market. So to strike a balance between ensuring affordability and nurturing ongoing pharmaceutical innovation, prices of new drug treatments need to match the value they deliver. A value-based pricing approach ensures that manufacturers are not only encouraged to create high-value therapies, but also discouraged from pursuing less beneficial drugs. 3 principles should guide pricing policies as it relates to rare disease. Price should reflect value, which should be comprehensively assessed based on the benefits patients and their families prefer. Second, value assessment should be based on strong evidence, measured not only through randomized clinical trials, but also through the ongoing collection of real-world evidence. Third, continued research should be rewarded beyond a drug's primary indication. This last point is particularly salient for orphan drugs. Under the IRA, drugs with an orphan designation as their sole FDA-approved indication are exempt from future drug price negotiations, but the IRA does not extend this exemption to drugs with multiple rare indications. This diminishes the incentives manufacturers have for exploring potential alternative uses for existing drugs in treating other rare diseases. Follow-on indications are a critical pathway for more cost-effective innovation, especially in the realm of rare diseases where the limited sizes of patient markets constrain revenues. Consider the fact that the average 5-year revenues for orphan drugs are 40% lower than they are for non-orphan drugs. Moreover, ultra-rare diseases truly low prevalence lack viable R&D incentives without other supporting mechanisms. It is conceivable that this complication brought on by the IRA can be addressed through policy improvements like the Orphan Cures Act that could reinforce our society's desire to protect the interests of patients suffering from rare diseases. While lowering pharmaceutical prices may seem at first like a logical approach in improving accessibility, this comes with a significant trade-off. They diminish future drug innovation. Blunt price controls are not the answer because they are counterproductive from the perspective of improving patient health. Instead, ensuring access to cutting-edge treatments among rare diseases necessitates the exploration of innovative financing mechanisms, such as subscription-based payment models or approaches that amortize the cost insurers pay for a life-saving new treatment based on drug effectiveness. These types of solutions will create a more sustainable system that prioritizes patient access while simultaneously fostering valuable innovation for patients. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Davis for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, and distinguished members, I thank you for the opportunity to testify on this Rare Disease Day. I am a widow who recently lost her husband to glioblastoma, a rare brain cancer. I am a rare disease parent, and I am a rare disease patient advocate. Our rare disease community includes 1 in 10 Americans affected by more than 10,000 rare diseases, and 95% of rare diseases lack an approved treatment. At the current pace, it will take thousands of years to secure treatments for all rare diseases. Meanwhile, a third of children with rare diseases will not survive to their 5th birthday. It is crucial we foster research and development of additional rare disease treatments and that rare disease patients can access their treatments upon approval. I joined the rare disease community in 2011 when doctors diagnosed our newborn son, Hunter, with SMA. Our world forever changed. SMA is like ALS in babies. It robs the ability to move, swallow, and ultimately breathe. And at the time was the #1 genetic cause of death for infants in the US. Doctors told us there was no treatment and no hope, but we couldn't afford to listen. The stakes were too high. With the help of a researcher, we manufactured a compound in the US and took it to Mexico for a trial. 8 weeks after his diagnosis, Hunter was the first SMA patient to receive a disease-modifying treatment, and that saved his life. SMA has 3 FDA-approved treatments, and every state screens newborns for SMA. Our SMA community in the US has largely achieved what we want for the greater rare disease community: pre-symptomatic diagnosis and treatment. Hunter's SMA diagnosis would not be the only devastating rare diagnosis for our family. In June of 2022, my husband Curtis was diagnosed with glioblastoma, a lethal rare brain cancer. We knew Curtis's glioblastoma diagnosis was a death sentence, yet we still held out hope that we could secure another medical miracle, as we had for Hunter. Sadly, this time, science and luck would not be on our side. Glioblastoma falls squarely within the 95% of rare conditions lacking a disease-modifying treatment. Curtis fought fiercely and courageously. Despite having the poorest biomarkers, his tumor invading his motor strip, and being on high-dose steroids, Curtis was in the 25% of glioblastoma patients who survived more than 1 year. This is because Curtis had access to innovative treatments that slowed the progression of his glioblastoma for some time. These innovative treatments allowed us to spend more time and make more cherished memories with Curtis. Curtis died on June 14th at the age of 54. I was by his side when he died, and I watched him take his final breath. I lost my husband, partner in adventure, and amazing father to our 5 children. He was an exceptional partner in all aspects of our relationship, including his partnership in being a caregiver for Hunter. Although glioblastoma is a rare cancer, it is claimed well-respected and loved persons by those here in our nation's capital, including Senator Ted Kennedy, Beau Biden, and Senator John McCain. Congress recognized the unmet need for rare disease treatments and the additional barriers to orphan drug development born out of the small patient populations and passed the Orphan Drug Act in 1983. The ODA incentivizes the development of orphan drugs for rare diseases. Unfortunately, orphan drugs with more than one indication become eligible for price negotiation under the IRA. This provision undermines the ODA and jeopardizes continued research, development, and funding of orphan drugs that our rare disease community so desperately needs. Yesterday, ARPA-H announced a $48.3 million award to Evercure to develop an AI-driven platform to revolutionize the future of drug development and repurposing. It's much easier to leverage existing orphan drugs for additional rare indications than to develop novel drugs. However, the IRA significantly threatens the likelihood that orphan drugs identified as candidates to treat another rare indication would reach the rare disease patients they could help. The Orphan Cures Act encourages repurposing orphan drugs by exempting them from Medicare drug price negotiation so long as they only treat rare conditions. This is a fix that our rare disease community needs. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here and being an advocate. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
So that concludes all of our opening statements, and we will now move to members' questions. And I will recognize myself 5 minutes to begin the questioning period. And we talked about, we heard some testimony on pediatric priority review vouchers. I know accelerated approvals moving forward. All of us have, and there's advocates here in the audience today, have people come to our office and talk about access to drugs and access to, they're against time, bumping against time. And so it's important. And we have to remember that it may only advance a few months, but a few months can be all the difference in the world. I've had a constituent with a child with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. He said, if I could just, they can't reverse the damage that the disease does to them, but if they could stop it, they can stop it where they are. So time does matter, and so that's important for us. We can't dismiss that in an academic kind of way. Professor Chen, we're talking about, we keep hearing the term negotiations, but it's really price control. Congress uses the power to tax in order to set up price controls. And I know everybody here either has a PhD, JD, or an MD, and I have neither, but I did have public school, high school economics, and price controls always bring, I know you can have elaborate systems to prevent it, but it always brings either lower quality or shortages. And so would you and we talked about Europe and what Europe pays, and it is frustrating that there are a lot of free riders on the American taxpayer for paying for innovation and the research in drugs. But if we don't pay for it, we won't get it. And so what I say is that you can't get what Europe pays without getting what Europe gets. And so would you talk about the European model for price controls and the limit that they have on access to life-saving drugs?
Sure. Schaefer Center research, my colleagues have shown that if we adopt European price controls in the United States, the outcome is lower life expectancy. And the reason for this is because price controls limit incentives for innovation. In the US, without price controls, we see access to new innovation quicker, and we see also more new innovation, which improves the lives of patients.
Well, thank you. And I want to kind of move to Dr. Basu. You talked about Dr. Miller Meeks's bill. I live in Bowling Green, Kentucky, an hour from Nashville. So people in my area, even though they live in Kentucky, a lot of them use Vanderbilt. We have a world-class center. You can be in northern Kentucky and be 10 minutes from Cincinnati General. And the wonderful people from southern Indiana use our great facilities in Louisville. And so state lines don't sometimes become a barrier when you have Medicaid. So that's why that's before us. You talked about it. But I also talked to you and Ms. Davis. I have a bill to help people pay for expenses. Also, they have to travel. And so would you kind of talk about how expenses, so I have ability for some manufacturers to help assist with lodging, travel, meals, how that can be a barrier for people to come to get, even if they have access to the care?
Happy to answer. I think we definitely appreciate the goal of that particular bill. Anything that supports care coordination and any aspect of care outside of a child's state We're interested in exploring those policies that will alleviate the burdens for children and families in order for them to get the highest quality care. And it really is a burden. For some of these really life-saving, life-altering, you heard from Ms. Davis, spectacularly changing the way kids' lives, kids who before the kind of treatments Ms. Davis was talking about would never sit up, never talk, never eat on their own. These kids now can walk and talk, and it's truly amazing. But for some of these treatments, and Dr. Float can discuss this even more, kids have to be a month in the hospital. They have to be under very close supervision because they can have extreme reactions that need to be taken care of. And if they live, your state like mine, if they're very far from an academic center, they're going to need some support. So anything that we can do to support that is great.
Right. We're looking to have access to close enough to drive, but it gets to the other bill that you talked about. It's across state lines. We have that across state. And like I said, Indiana's come to Kentucky for great health care as well. So, Ms. Davis, you talk about your experience. I know what you had to do. I know I understand you had to have a bus in order to travel to make sure you could get to the places you need to go, and just the expense of what you had to go through as a family.
Yeah, our family is very fortunate that we do have the expenses that we were able to bear that on our own, but that's not the case for many families in the rare disease community, and they need access to airfare, other travel, hotel accommodations. When they're traveling with children, you have to remember they're also having parents that are missing work so they can go with the children to these treatments. So they're hitting a lot of additional expenses for the families.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your testimony, all of you being here today. My time is expiring, so I will yield back, and I'll recognize the ranking member, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In listening to each of you, I have to say this. You're a blessing to our country, that we have, such experts that have devoted their lives to bring that expertise for the betterment of humankind. So bravo to each one of you. I'm deeply moved by what you do and your testimony today. Dr. Chen, I want to take exception to part of your testimony. I don't have a question, but to leave the impression that with the federal poverty line for a family of four in our country at $31,200, that you would reject affordability for drugs in our country. It really just can't stand. I mean, I just reject it out of hand. Anyone with a child that has a rare disease would want to bring every last thing from themselves, their extended family and friends to help that child. But to reject, affordability when some drugs are hundreds of thousands of dollars, I wouldn't be able to afford that. And I have a pretty good job. And I don't think you would either on your salary. So the affordability of drugs in this country is an essential policy, in my view. And we can innovate and we can bring the prices down as well. And anything that stands in the way of that, I have to say, I think does not serve the American people well. And it's the Congress that has to put that policy in place. It's the Congress. And after, 75 years, we finally got to do it. And bravo to those that voted for it. Dr. Crystal McCall is one of my constituents. She's also a leading cancer researcher at Stanford University that I have the privilege of representing, and former chief of the pediatric oncology branch at the National Cancer Institute. She said the following about the FDA's Rare Pediatric Disease Voucher Program, which my Creating Hope Reauthorization Act would extend for 4 years. Quote, before the program, I used to go with my hat in hand to beg investors to consider a potential drug. Now people take a second look and are interested in developing drugs. For example, Novartis CD19 CAR, known as Kymriah, the first cell-based gene therapy approved in the United States, was approved in children first. That would have never happened without the voucher program, unquote. That's quite a compliment. So, Doctor, is it Flout? Flott.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I know the answer, but I want it for the record. Have children benefited from drugs made possible by the Rare Pediatric Disease Voucher Program, drugs like Kymriah?
Well, in my opinion, Congressman, that they certainly have. And I just want to describe the phenomenon in private sector investment in gene therapy. Much of it has been in the high-risk biotech sector, later to transition to pharma. And many of the investors in that sector are looking at time. They're looking for a relatively quick return. Now, you can argue whether they should be doing that or not, but the fact is that with some of the discouraging news in other markets, since 2021, over 50 rare diseases have had their clinical programs in gene therapy abandoned. There's an article came out this month in Human Gene Therapy, which I'm happy to share with the committee, that describes each one of those programs that was stopped. We're at the mercy, and families of patients with rare disease are at the mercy of the investment community to some extent for these highly innovative treatments that are really going to come out of the small biotech companies.
I represent many of those small biotech companies. Of the more than 7,000 rare diseases, 70% are rare genetic conditions present from the time a child is born, which I believe Ms. Davis spoke to. How can we ensure that children aren't left out of the new frontier in cell and gene therapy? Oh, I'm over my time.
For the record.
Yeah, we can take that for the record.
I didn't know if you were
Yes.
speaking to me or Dr.